So tonight we are going to talk about making the hard conversations or beginning the hard conversations. So I guess the question is, what is a hard conversation? Well, a hard conversation is that conversation that maybe you don't want to have. You're resistant, you're reluctant, you're, kind of skirting the issue, or it could be a conversation that your loved one doesn't want to have, that they avoid it or they become angry about it, and you fear that it is going to be confrontational. So it could be anything from the discussion of a diagnosis. For my father, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, and that was a hard conversation. We went step by step through the process, but ultimately, at one point, he had to be told that there was nothing more that could be done. That's a hard conversation. Maybe the hard conversation is knowing that your loved one needs to somehow have their care up leveled, whether that means bringing some help into the home, or if that means, leaving independent living and maybe moving in with you or moving to a facility. That is a hard conversation that's full of many, many layers of decisions that have to be made. And each and every one of those steps can be a hard conversation, from, just the simple task of moving itself to the realization that they're losing independence, right? And the hard conversation can even come early in the process, when you're talking about, estate planning, and you realize that, some things need to be decided upon. Excuse me, and you would prefer that your loved one be part of the decision making before it becomes too late for them to really cognitively understand what is happening. And those are some of the reasons that we have to begin hard conversations. And then you ask, well, do I have to have the hard conversation with them? And the answer is no. You get to decide if you want to be part of the hard conversation. When my father was told that there's really not another treatment for stage 4 COPD, and you're just going to steadily decline, I didn't have that conversation. I led that conversation up to the doctor, and I was there and I was in the room and I was sitting behind him holding back my emotion, but he needed to hear it from someone. And that doctor said to him, you need to think about your wife at home and whether or not she can take care of you. And if she can't, then you need to start making the decisions about what you should do. And he started the conversation, right? Members of clergy can be people who can help start the conversation, whatever it is that you find difficult. Members of the hospice team sometimes can start conversations about next steps or final decisions. So it doesn't always have to fall on your lap. But, starting that conversation, it's not like one day you're going to say, let's sit down right here at the kitchen table and we're going to talk about X, Y, and Z, and we're going to get answers from now until, end of life. Nobody wants to have or start that conversation. How the conversations start is, with little bite-sized chunks of information. Um, you sort of listen and you hear their worries and you hear their concerns. And that's actually part of the conversation. When they mention that the house is getting too much for them, then you step in to the conversation and you listen to what they have to say with respect and with compassion. because the conversation can get very emotional. And sometimes that emotion is anger because they're angry that they have to even have the conversation because they're losing their independence. And sometimes the conversation becomes emotional and sadness and grief when they realize that their spouse is no longer with them and the house is too much for them to take care of. And they have to make, those hard decisions. So, when those emotions erupt and come up, if it's not progressing the conversation, then it's time to back away from the conversation. And there'll be another opportunity, to speak about whatever the topic is. But, being gentle and being compassionate, that's what opens the door and allows your loved one, to share what they're thinking and what they're feeling. You might assume that, just because you haven't talked about it, that some of these hard decisions aren't forefront in their mind. I mean, you got to figure that they have peers their age or going through similar things, or neighbors who they've watched have certain experiences, and they have feelings and thoughts and opinions about those things. So to start the conversation, to begin the conversation, you look for those opportunities to sort of jump on and to talk about it. Your neighbor has been ill, in and out of the hospital for months, till finally, excuse me, sorry, until finally the family has brought them home and they have a hospital bed, and hospice has started, and that hospital bed has been set up in the living room near the window so that they can look out. And you can say to your loved one, what do you think about that? Would, if the time came and something like that happened, would you want to be in a hospital bed in the living room? And of course, their first reaction might be, well, heck no, I want to be in my own bed. Right. But then you work around it and you talk about, well, what's the reason for the hospital bed itself? And what kind of care is being given because of that? And, would you rather be someplace where nurses and aides can be at your beck and call? What if your spouse wasn't around? What would you do if it was only you and I live a state away? And then when it gets too much, you back away from it. And then you can come to it again. Oh, somebody at church or a family friend for a long time, they've just moved into assisted living. What do you think about assisted living? Let's go visit them, see what it's like. What are they saying about it? Have you called them on the phone? What? They're doing activities. That's interesting. That would be kind of cool. Would you like to do activities with people your own age instead of sitting here watching The Price is Right? And you broach those subjects and you have those conversations. Speaking of The Price is Right, it's no accident really that all of those commercials for life insurance or some of those other topics come up during The Price is Right, right? And there's an opening to have a conversation. Oh, life insurance. Have you thought about life insurance? Do you have life insurance? What would you do? If you sold this house, what are you going to do for dealing with the snow this winter? What plan should we have? That's how you begin the conversation. And you just kind of take note of everything. So you're not going to sit and have a single conversation and go from step A to step Z and get all of the answers, but it's up to you to sort of be putting these answers away. And by doing this, you're sort of finding the roadmap of where this caregiving might take you as things progress with your loved one. And there might come a time where they can't really logically give you an answer. They might be beyond them to sort of problem solve in that way. But if you've had some of these conversations previously, you can kind of see what their wishes were when they were at their best mentally. And that helps you make those decisions. So, excuse me, some of the conversations can start with like, I need your help with something, or, I know in my family, my in-laws were dealing with a large property. They own a farm. And so they were dealing with this large property and deciding, what to do with it. Estate tax would be a lot. And what should you do? And should you sign it over? And how would you sign it over? And what would the, sort of stipulations be around that, and who would you sign it over to? And so that was kind of going on in my in-laws' life, but I brought that topic to my own parents, and said, what are we going to do with the house here when the house becomes too much, or when, my father passes and my mother is left for it with it, and it certainly would be too much with her. And my father was really not interested in having that conversation, and we broached it many times. And in the end, for him, he never had to deal with it because it was passed on to my mother. But his wishes were not that he was going to have us, take it over. But, we knew that as we went through the process, and you can ask some things, like what do you think about, whatever. What would you think about getting a stair lift? My brothers and I have a standing joke that my father's solution to their house, they live in a one-story ranch house, perfect, right? Except it was on a hill. Not perfect, actually became a problem just about every step of the way with their aging process. And his solution was that so their garage came in underneath their house in the basement area, and then you walked up through the basement to the main floor, or from the outside, you had to go up steps to enter the front door or the back door. So his solution was, well, I can drive into the garage, so I would just put a little like mini elevator in there. And, the idea truly wasn't too far-fetched. I mean, where the elevator would go really was a room that was accessible and it would work, except that he never thought he needed it. It was a great plan, but never enacted, right? And of course, very costly. So then, we had the conversation about a stair lift, and, oh, I don't need a stair lift. I don't go downstairs anyways. No, just to leave the house every time you have to go to a doctor's appointment, right? I need to, we kept working and working and working at these things. And truly until his last days, the house being only accessible through stairs was a problem. It was a problem with ambulance drivers. It was a problem with his oxygen and lack of ability to go up and down stairs. I mean, it was a problem every step of the way for them. And then you can start some of the hard conversations like, with the, do you remember when? I use that a lot when dealing with my mother. Eventually, we had to move my mother into assisted living. Her dementia got to be too much. She was too unpredictable, and she really was just scared herself to be home alone. And, that was evidenced by the fact that she would barricade the doors and the windows and sit in her own bedroom sort of in the back of the house and not turn on lights, and then of course not having the lights turned on and having all the shadows that scared her more. But she would never really admit to it. Only sometimes she would admit to it, but ultimately we knew she was scared. So the opportunity arose to move her to assisted living. And I do often say to my clients that a time of crisis is often the time for change. It sort of pushes you into making a change. And when things are in flux with a crisis, sometimes making that change right then and there makes the change not quite so harsh. So for my mother, she had the terrible fall, and was in rehab for 4 months. That was the time for change. I knew if we let her go back to her house where she was scared, we were never going to get her out of there. And so we took the opportunity to move her straight from rehab into assisted living. And there were plenty of times as she was in assisted living, that I would say to her when she would be anxious because I wasn't spending enough time, or what she thought, was enough time, and she lost track of time, of course. But I would say to her, like, do you remember when you did this with grandma, which was her mother? Do you remember what it was like moving her into a facility? And, my mother would, and she would go off with stories about how difficult it was, how challenging it was. And then, she would kind of understand what I was getting at, and that would, pacify her for a while. Hard conversation, but putting it into a context that she, can remember. So important conversations, difficult conversations, had in very minuscule bite-sized pieces, will actually get you more of a result than attempting to truly sit down and try to have this big formal conversation. We tried that once with my father. We were right at the beginning of hospice. And of course, we didn't know everything that hospice entailed. We understood the general idea, but didn't realize exactly how it was going to play out. And I called my brothers in, and they live out of town and out of state. And we had a conversation that, was met with a lot of animosity and anger. And, but all of that was really his anger, my father's anger at losing his independence and seeing what, was actually happening with him. I probably was more compassionate about it than my brothers were. And for them, it was a time thing. Like, I'm here now, let's make the decisions. I'm going to have to leave by Monday. And that's not quite the way that these types of decisions necessarily are made. So I want to show you something here that I am going to share with you as part of um, our program here. So let me share my screen. And this is something that I think might help you with these hard conversations. So let me hit play here. So what I am going to gift you is a little booklet that talks about future possibilities, right? You can couch it that way. Future possibilities. Nobody wants a conversation about the end of life. Nobody wants a conversation about the nursing home, right? But future possibilities, that I could have a conversation around. So I'm going to provide for you several sheets in this little booklet that sort of give you a prompt to allow your loved one to kind of gauge a topic on a sliding scale. So if you look at this, the very first question says, as a patient, I'd like to know. And one end of the spectrum is only the basics about my condition and my treatment. So that's a person who might be fearful of hearing information from the doctor, or they might feel that it's over their head and they don't really understand it. So they only really want to know the basics. And then the other side of the scale is that I want to know all of the details about my condition and my treatment. And you find out sort of in this, 5, from a scale of 1 to 5, where do they sit on that? And then that can open a conversation. Well, I want to know what's wrong with me, and I want to know how long I'll be in the hospital, but I don't understand the medicine stuff. When you have that conversation and they say something like that, and that's your indicator that, okay, they want somebody with them when they're at the doctor's or when something serious happens and they're in the emergency room, right? Let's look at the next one. When there is a medical decision to be made, I would like. So one end of the spectrum is I would like members of my care circle to do what they think is best. So there you have the indicator. Okay, we should be thinking of medical power of attorney, right? We should start looking into that. And then the other end of the spectrum, got a dry throat tonight. The other end of the spectrum is I would like to have a say in every healthcare decision. And so here is and then you get to decide, well, what is their cognitive ability? Do I need to be there, or can I send a health worker to go with them to a doctor's appointment? Do I have somebody trusted that can explain things to them if they don't understand? And then one more here. What are your concerns about medical care? One end of the spectrum is I worry I won't get the right care or enough care. Again, another indication that somebody needs to help me make these decisions. And then the other end of the spectrum is I worry that I will get too much care. So this is an indicator like, okay, we're not going to, necessarily move them to a facility until they are absolutely ready, or we're not going to bring in a 24-hour nurse, into the home. So I give you a couple of pages of these types of questions that really do take you the whole way through to some end of life questions and decisions. And again, you wouldn't want to take this and sit down for a whole day or, a whole meeting, right, and go over it. But, maybe the time is right. Maybe they are open to it. When my father got his diagnosis with cancer and he started taking treatments and he realized how serious it was, he was open to all of these discussion questions. And my mother then was too. And I remember sitting at lunch with a bologna sandwich at their kitchen table, having these conversations. And I had a little form that I was filling out, and we used it, through his entire course. And we referred to it, we came back to it. I have a client who very much did something very similar. And as things were getting down to the end and other family members were questioning decisions, they actually pulled out the document that they were keeping notes on and said, this is what mom said. This is what she wanted. This is what her plan was. And it was really, really helpful, really, for them to go through and to use it. So, what I'm going to share with you here, a reminder about having bite-sized conversations. What I want to share here with you is you're going to get a little digital download of this booklet called Future Possibilities. And in it, you will get the little questions that you can kind of fill out on a scale from 1 to 5. But I'm also going to include in that the being an advocate for your carry with dementia. That adds a whole other level to how soon you want to bring up this conversation, and how much do you really think, that you need to share with them. Is it important for a person to know that they've been diagnosed with dementia? Is that going to serve a purpose? And you get to decide as the caregiver, is it worth explaining this to them? Or would I rather just talk with them compassionately to find out, what do they value at this point in their lives? What are they scared of that's coming up, in their future? And how can I make them feel better? Okay. Thank you so much. I hope to be seeing you very soon. Have a good night.